The world as it is. You were promised a future, not in the abstract specifically. You were told that if you worked hard enough, studied long enough, played by the rules, and kept your head down, the life you were building would hold. That the ground beneath your feet was solid, that the institutions protecting you were sound, that the people speaking to you from screens and podiums and front pages had your best interest at heart. You believed it, most of us did, not out of naivety, but out of necessity, because the alternative was simply too large a thing to fathom, that the entire architecture of the world you were born into was built on a foundation of managed deception, that the ground was never solid, that it was never meant to be, not whilst you were collecting the children from school, paying the bills, keeping your head above water, getting through the week. But something has changed. You can feel it in the price of your weekly shop, in the conversations at your kitchen table that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago, in the colleague who has gone quiet, in the friend who lost everything despite doing nothing wrong, in the growing, undeniable sense that the distance between the world being described to you and the world you're actually living in has become too wide to ignore. That is not anxiety. That is not cynicism. That is your intelligence working correctly. The question is not whether something has broken. The question is whether it was ever whole to begin with. The disorder you are witnessing across economics, geopolitics, across the institutions that were supposed to stand between power and its victims is not a malfunction. It is not the consequence of poor decisions made by otherwise well-intentioned people. Disorder on this scale, sustained across this many fronts simultaneously, does not come from incompetence. It comes from design, and it is sustained by a media apparatus whose purpose is not to inform you, but to exhaust you. The noise is the point. The outrage is the point. The relentless churn of trivial urgency is the point. Because whilst you are watching that, the stories that matter never reach you. The ones that will shape your life, your children's lives, the lives of billions of people across this planet who are never consulted, never considered, and never asked their opinion about any of it, gone, buried, or simply never told at all. It requires no grand conspiracy, no single architect, only a shared interest in what you do not know, held by those who own the platforms, the newspapers, the networks, and the political parties, and the resources to ensure you never find out. That is not a theory, it is an industry. What it produces has a clinical name: news fatigue, the psychological exhaustion that comes from too much information, the point at which the volume and relentlessness of it all makes you want to stop consuming it altogether. The engineered collapse of your sense that knowing things changes anything. The deliberate cultivation of futility. That is the point, and once you understand that, everything begins to make sense. So let us start at the structure, not with today's headlines, but with the architecture beneath them. Because what is happening now was not improvised, it was built, and it has been standing largely unexamined for the better part of a century. For 8 decades following the Second World War, the international order was sold to the world on a specific set of premises: human rights, the sovereignty of nation states, the rule of international law, the sanctity of borders. These were presented not as the interests of particular powers, but as universal values. The hard-won architecture of a civilization that had looked into the abyss of 2 world wars and chosen finally to build something better. They were not universal values, they were instruments of management, applied rigorously to the periphery, suspended routinely at the center. This was not a secret kept from historians. It was documented in the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, when Britain and the United States dismantled a democratically elected government to protect oil interests, in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo in 1961, organized by the Belgian and American intelligence within months of Congolese independence, in the installation of Pinochet in Chile in 1973, underwritten by Washington, that ended in the torture and disappearance of thousands, in the structural adjustment programs that systematically dismantled the public institutions of the Global South throughout the 1980s and 1990s, whilst Western governments lectured their population about the virtues of the free market and the sanctity of sovereignty. The evidence was always there for anyone willing to look at it directly. What is new is not the behavior. What is new is the absence of pretense and the willingness to deploy the same tactics at home against the very populations whose taxes fund the empire and whose silence sustains it. Consider what has happened in the space of the last 6 months. We're not even halfway through 2026. The elected president of Venezuela was kidnapped and extradited to the United States, not removed by his own people, not held accountable by any internationally recognized legal process, taken. The country's resources, its oil, its land, its economic sovereignty redistributed accordingly. In an earlier era, this would have been conducted with the careful architecture of plausible deniability, a sponsored coup, a color revolution, a manufactured crisis. The fingerprints would have been carefully wiped from the door handle before the cameras even arrived. In January 2026, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said what virtually no Western leader had been willing to say from that podium. He told the assembled leaders of global finance and government to stop invoking the rules-based international order as though it still functions as advertised, to call it what it is, in his own words, a system of intensifying great power rivalry, where the most powerful pursue their interests using economic integration as coercion. He acknowledged that countries like Canada had built their prosperity inside a story they knew to be partially false, a system mired in hypocrisy, overseeing rising inequality, accepting skewed global rules, and supporting unjust wars. His conclusion was as stark as it was overdue. We know the old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. This was not a dissident speaking from the margins. This was the Prime Minister of one of the world's most stable liberal democracies standing before the global elite, acknowledging that the system his own country had championed and profited from was, in his own words, a pleasant fiction. Then consider this. The International Criminal Court was established for precisely one purpose: to hold the world's most powerful actors to account when their own institutions would not. Its chief prosecutor, Karim has confirmed that a senior elected leader told him directly, and I quote, that the court was built for Africa and thugs like Putin, and not for the West and its allies. He has further confirmed that David Cameron, then British Foreign Secretary, threatened him in a telephone call in April 2024, warning of the United Kingdom's withdrawal from and defunding of the ICC if the court pursued arrest warrants for Israeli officials. Khan confirmed it was true. He said he was not angry. He said he was sad. The system is not broken. It is functioning precisely as designed. What you are witnessing is not the collapse of the order. It is the next phase of it. Empires in decline do not simply retreat. They extract. And during the extraction, the cost is not borne by the empire. It is borne by you, in your energy bills, in your cost of living, in the quiet contraction of your economic future. A contraction you have already begun to feel, and which will deepen before it eases. The states that were integrated into the American-led economic architecture, dependent on its supply chains, its financial infrastructure, its security guarantees, are now discovering that the terms of that dependency were never reciprocal. The empire is not abandoning its peripheries out of weakness, it is cannibalizing it. And the states that built their economic survival around access to that system are now being asked to survive without it, on foundations that decades of dependency made structurally unsustainable. As Carney himself observed, when smaller nations negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, they negotiate from weakness. They accept what is offered, they compete with each other to be the most accommodating. That, he said, is not sovereignty. It is the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. In West Asia, the consequences are no longer abstract. A military campaign has killed thousands and displaced thousands more. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately a fifth of the world's oil supply passes, has been disrupted. Energy costs have risen across every economy on Earth, regardless of their involvement in the conflict, but this disruption is not simply collateral damage. It is strategically convenient. When the arteries of trade between the global south are severed or destabilized, those states are forced back into dependency on Western-aligned financial systems and supply chains. The chaos in West Asia does not weaken the empire, it reinforces it. It forecloses the alternatives and it ensures that the emerging connections between non-aligned states, the trade corridors, the currency agreements, the cooperative frameworks being quietly built outside the dollar system, are strangled before they can mature. That is the mechanism. That is what the headlines do not tell you. And that is precisely why this channel exists. These are not isolated events. They are the visible symptoms of a structural shift that has been building for decades and accelerating in plain sight. Which brings us to why this channel exists. Not to replace one narrative with another, not to tell you what to conclude, but to give you the documented evidence, the historical context, and the analytical frameworks to read what is happening clearly on your own terms, without waiting for permission from the institutions that have a vested interest in your confusion. The gap between what is reported and what is happening has never been wider. Between the official narrative and the historical record, between the world as it is presented to you and the world as it actually functions, that gap is not accidental. It is maintained, and it is maintained because an informed population is a population that asks difficult questions. Each week on the Sykes-Picot Prism, we will examine the forces genuinely reshaping civilization, the geopolitical shifts, the economic realities, the historical patterns, and the human consequences that rarely make it past the editorial filter of mainstream media. History, current affairs, economics, technology, anthropology, not through a single civilizational lens, but through every lens available. The view from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, from the places whose stories have been told about them rather than by them. The mask has fallen. That is, unexpectedly, an opportunity. You can only analyze clearly what you can see plainly, and for the first time in a long time, the thing in front of us is exactly what it appears to be. Next week, we will begin at the beginning. One afternoon in London in 1916, 2 men, 1 map, and a line that is still being paid for in blood today. This has been the Sykes-Picot Prism. There is no freedom without knowledge. Stay curious.